The hour 3 o'clock having arrived. We'll call the meeting of the Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee to order. First item is Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, public comment. Nobody has approached me. Nobody's approached you. Anybody wish to make a public comment? If not, we will move on to the minutes from the November 8th meeting. What are your wishes? They were in the packet. Moved by Chair Gibbs. Is there seconded by Supervisor Hart? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no.
Aye.
That motion carries. We will now move on to item 6. If, without objection, I'd like to take items 4 and 5 first and come back to deal with items 1, 2, and 3. So much as the others involve members of the public and others, and the rest are internal. So if we could jump to item 6B4, consideration of the initial resolutions for proposed digester projects. I'll turn it over to Administrator Leonard.
Sure, I'll be very brief, Mr. Chair. This is just put on your agenda to follow up from the educational presentation that was provided at your voters meeting on October 24th to the full county board relative to one of the requests for initial resolution for industrial revenue bond conduit bonding. And we do have on the call today, I understand, Attorney Templin is here to answer questions from the committee. But really the issue before this committee is whether or not to move consideration of that initial resolution as explained by Attorney Templin and the other members that made the presentation to the full board for further consideration. Following the meeting, I did circulate pictures of a facility that I received from Attorney Templin and her staff to the board. I understand also that Attorney Templin's staff sent me yesterday, or there was a request from one board member for kind of an idea as to what that initial offering document packet would look like for investors. And I did receive from Attorney Templin's staff a past example of one of those initial offering document packets, and I can make that available to the full board. But with that, Mr. Chair, I would just turn it over to Attorney Templin to provide any additional information and context. Again, my understanding is that the entity wishing to move forward with this project would like a determination from the board relative to that initial resolution relatively quickly. I believe, Attorney Templin, you were hoping to have that in December. Is that correct?
That's correct. And the reason for that is for every tax-exempt bond that's done, we need what's called volume cap. Every state is allowed so many tax-exempt bond issues to be, and it's based on population. So in Wisconsin, we get $600 million of volume cap. $300 million of that goes to the housing authority, and $300 million is administered. Just basically, they keep track to make sure Wisconsin doesn't have more tax-exempt bonds issued than are allowed by federal law. And so the WEDC monitors that. The borrower applies for volume cap, and to obtain that allocation of volume cap, they need to have an initial resolution in place. Right now, the WEDC is evaluating the volume cap application, and it's anticipated that because this is an exempt facility project, the WEDC would award volume cap from 2023 if we have the resolution in place, and then we would be allowed to carry that forward into 2024. So we wouldn't be looking to issue the bonds until the first quarter of 2024, but just from a procedural step standpoint, they want the resolution in place before they award the volume cap. When we talked in October, there was some concern about, November meetings being really absorbed with budget. And I said at that time, certainly we can wait until December. And I explained that to the WEDC and they were fine with that. So our request would be that the full board consider that resolution in December to keep us on track.
So this issue has been, or is being reviewed by 3 separate committees, Environmental Resources Committee, Extension Education Economic Development, and this committee. I don't know that we've had all of them weigh in. I know there have been some questions at some of the committees. We have this meeting and the meeting on December 13th in which we can act. I think for the purposes of today, I think the important issue would be to raise what questions and concerns we might have relative to potentially advancing an initial resolution to the board. And at that 13th meeting, we will have had an opportunity for the other committees to provide feedback to us in determining what the policy is of the county board. Linda, could I ask a question? Is the county board approval required whether we go through the county or we go through the state? In either case?
It's a different concept. We have another potential issuer for the bonds would be the Public Finance Authority, but the way that Public Finance Authority statute was written, in order for you to waive your right to be the conduit issuer and let the PFA do it, both the county and the village where the project is located, or town, I can't remember, it's village, I think, of Maine, right? Need to consent that they don't care, that it's fine with them if the PFA is the issuer for the bonds. And if anyone's interested, it's a crazy requirement, and it was put in the statute because Milwaukee was convinced they were going to issue lots and lots of bonds, and they wanted to be conduit issuer, and they don't. No one goes to them because they want a fortune to do it. But they wanted to create a kind of an obstacle to the PFA getting a first shot at being the conduit issuer. And so now it's in the statute, and it adds some steps. You are your name, the county name, and the village name do not appear on the bonds. You would have no liability. You would simply be consenting, saying, we don't care. We'd rather not issue the bonds, and go ahead, PFA, and issue them. That can be done. In Milwaukee, it has to be done by resolution of both the county board and the city council. In all other counties, a simple certificate, a consent certificate signed by the highest elected administrator or executive of the county or the village is sufficient, and it doesn't need board action. Unless your local protocol would call for board action. And, I know it's a new concept for a lot of communities, but one of the reasons, and I know we did get we have another project in Kewaunee County, and they adopted the initial resolution, but they in the interim now are developing what they would expect to charge as the issuer, and that may be something you haven't discussed yet, but the initial resolution is simply an initial. It doesn't bind you to do it without further action. And that action could include whatever fee you wanted. I guess I should say reasonable fee.
Hey, Supervisor Hart.
Thank you. I think this is a question for the attorney. I wanted to know if there's any downside for the entity seeking the bond if they were to go through the Public Finance Authority versus through the county.
I wouldn't say there's a downside. I would say that it would depend on what your issuer's fee is. The issuer's fee at the PFA level is a little bit steep, but manageable. And so I think that fee schedule you might want to look at if it's one or the other, and one of you is going to get the fee and one isn't, it might be something you want to look at and ask them. They used to have it posted online. I don't think they do anymore, their fee schedule, but I could certainly find that in the office tomorrow and send it to you, and it could guide you. I'm not going to say it's an easy thing. Your clerk will get a lot of paper. You will have legal counsel if you're the issuer, and they will advise you on documents. I believe, do you use Quarles and Brady when you do your bond issues?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, and they're very familiar with this structure, and they've worked on that before. So those fees that you would have for them would be paid by the borrower. All fees are paid by the borrower. But, there's an administrative cost with the clerk being absorbed with some of those things, I'm sure. And so is the fee enough of an offset, and is it attractive, or it's not my decision to make, but I would hope then if you didn't want to be the issuer, you could advise us fairly quickly so we could get those consents from you and from the village, and then move to the PFA.
And we have a representative from the village on the call. Have you discussed this at all at the village board meetings? Rich? I don't know if we're catching you off guard, but has the village board in Maine talked about this at all?
I would be surprised if they did, only because to this point in time, there was no need to go to the Village of Maine because we were looking for the county to be the issuer. So I would be surprised if they've had the discussion, but perhaps they're aware of the project. I don't know.
Chair Gibbs.
Well, I'm not so sure that I have any questions. I think a lot of the questions were answered at the presentation on the 24th. I think there's actually some upside to the county, at least beginning negotiations on whether or not we would look to the issuance. But I'm not sure that I have any questions. I think most of the questions that were brought forward, or all the questions that were brought forward initially, were answered during the presentation on the 24th. So I don't have any additional questions, and I think it would be to our advantage to at least move forward with an initial resolution and negotiations as to a fee that the county could potentially receive for the administration of it.
Supervisor Lemmer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, good. I am a little unlike Chair Gibbs. I do still have questions, and I think they're more based on the precedent we are setting by doing this. I'd like to see a policy. We talked about a month ago, or the last meeting maybe, about having a policy established before we did this, because it sets precedent. And since they can go to the state or the PFA, I would think, to be prudent, give them that alert and create our policy. And if we can get the policy made in time, then go forward with the negotiations. But I'm just a little nervous about moving forward without having some guidelines in place. And I do want to hear from the Village of Maine, as well as our Environmental Resource Committee.
Supervisor Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think as far as questions that I personally have, I don't think I have any questions at this time, but I would echo Supervisor Lemmer's statements that I would also like to hear from the Village of Maine more about this. For me, I view this as a big project that's smack dab in the middle of that village, and I would like to maintain a good relationship with the county and the village, so I'd want to know more about that. And maybe that's something that can be hammered out. I think a lot of their concerns are things that aren't really relevant to our specific committee. So I would be in favor of taking action after some of those other committees have kind of vetted this out a little bit more in terms of process. Thank you.
I'm going to ask Mike, have you had by any chance any discussions with any other counties like Kewanee relative to their policies and procedures relative to involvement in issuance of bonds like this?
I have not, Mr. Chair.
Is that something that could take place between now and the 13th?
It could.
Could we use that, trying to address Supervisor Lemmer's and Hart's concerns? Is that something that if we had it, we could bring it back? We've been engaged in conduit borrowing before in various, with Foremost Foods at one time, and most recently with Bug Tussle. The difference there is that the Bug Tussle resolution put the faith and credit of the county behind it. These do not. We had an elaborate series of agreements relative to Bug Tussle, whereas typically with the other bonding, it is much more limited. But would the committee like to advance that policy? I don't think that this issue is going away. I think that more and more people will be looking to it in our policy. Either is we're going to cooperate or we're not going to, and we're going to direct them elsewhere. I think that's probably a fundamental. And if we decide we're going to cooperate, then what are the terms and the conditions that we might want to put in place? Chair Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess the one thing that strikes me is, is effectively the project probably is going to move forward. I do not disagree that we have to have a good relationship with our neighbors and community, but I believe that the project is, some of the things that were addressed at the 24th meeting was the reduction in the smell, in the reduction in the odors, and there wasn't a considerable amount of increase in water demand. So the concerns, and again, the negotiations, but I do think that we, at minimum, owe it to the individuals to have a definitive decision as to whether we want to consider the initial resolution or not consider the resolution by December, to allow them the proper time if the county chooses not to. But I would still be in favor of at least initially starting that discussion as to what the fee would be that the county would receive, and again, the project, I think, alleviates some of the challenges that those big operations have. And we do have additional entities that have already put in interest requests for the county to potentially consider.
Supervisor Lemmer.
Yes, thank you again, Mr. Chair. I have some information that there will be an increase in water because the Vandergeese are planning on nearly doubling their animal units, which is going to need a draw of water, not due to the digesters, but just due to the additional animals that this digester will allow them to have. And I guess that's why I would like to hear from the Environmental Resources Committee and the Village of Maine, because it would be a shame if wells went dry for this project. So that may take a little longer than the December deadline to get that information. And then as far as another thing, I know when they did the presentation, he mentioned a different smell. And when I did some looking, that different smell is sulfur. So you might not smell the manure, but you may smell a byproduct called sulfur. That I'd like to know more information about that as well. So if we could hear from if Kewanee's is up and running, that would be great to just know what their experience is.
Could I ask a question? Maybe if if the county, I don't want to duplicate efforts here, but at the same time, if the county decides that they don't want to be the issuer, do you see any issues in providing consent to the PFA being the issuer? And I raise that question because all of the concerns that in questions you have are legitimate questions. But if all of the, to make this project happen, they have to get all air quality permitting, they have to get DNR permitting, they have to get the permitting. So the project is probably going to happen regardless. And they've never had any problem getting the permitting. And so I think the question is one of involvement and certainly curiosity, and we all want to do good things for the environment, but I don't think it will create a barrier to them ultimately doing the project. Will it be as successful? No, because they're going to pay a lot more in interest if they can't do it as a tax-exempt bond. But my question would be, if there's a high degree of confidence that even if you don't do the bonds, you would be okay with the PFA doing the bonds, then I could have the PFA issue, I could get an initial resolution from the PFA now telling them, okay, we don't know if we're going to use you, but if the county takes a pass on being the issuer, then they've indicated that they would consent to the PFA being the issuer. And that would get me a resolution in December that meets our needs, because it sounds like there are a lot of things you want to explore that might mean we can't get it in December.
A question.
Did that make sense?
I have a question as a follow-up to that. So, Lance, are you the signator to, or is the clerk is the signator to that? What basis would you, if the county didn't advance an initial resolution, what basis would we use for signing the certificate of consent? That we don't.
That we're not wanting to issue.
So it's just, it's a certificate of, the certificate of consent would say that we are not interested in issuing,
Correct.
but there's no
Correct.
provision for.
It says it's not an endorsement. Yeah, the certificate says specifically in it, it is, the consent is not an endorsement of the project. You're not involved in it. You're simply saying we don't care. And the justification for the consent, even if you didn't want to be the issuer, that's the justification. We've got plenty to do without being the issuer. And so we want to take a pass on being the issuer and let the PFA go ahead.
The question becomes one of what role do we play? And if we do the initial resolution and are involved in the process, we probably have more input into the project versus having the clerk sign the certificate of consent, unless the county board were to go on record as saying that they oppose the project, which I don't know that you would have the votes to do in time for the January or December timeline. But so Supervisor Hart.
Thank you. And a follow-up question with that. The Village of Maine would also have to do that exact same thing, correct?
Correct. They have to consent as well.
And then just to follow up on that, is there any way, not that I want the Village of Maine to do this, but is there any way that the Village of Maine can hinder this? Because what I don't want is for all of this to get held up and this project doesn't necessarily move forward because of something that we've done unnecessarily. And I want to know if we give that waive of consent, and what if like the village holds on it and doesn't make a decision, and then that delays this even further? Is that what could happen if the county doesn't issue the bonding?
Right. I mean, a couple things could happen. Either the Village of Maine, because they don't know about it yet, and because we were going to go through the county, we would have to contact them and make sure that they understood what we were asking and whether time allowed to get that consent or not. I don't know. But then secondly, you could consent, but if the Village of Maine did not consent, we still couldn't use the PFA. The statute is written that we need both.
Chair Gibbs.
Linda, so understanding that if you're withholding consent, isn't that saying that you wish to issue the bonds?
Yeah, I mean, it's odd because, as I said, the only reason that's in the statute is that Milwaukee County wanted to believe that they were going to be a conduit issuer for lots of bonds, and they were going to make money being a conduit issuer. Then the PFA was organized with the help of the Wisconsin Counties Association, and Milwaukee County balked and said they actually lobbied to put in the legislation, okay, but you're not going to be able to use the PFA unless you go to the county that the project is in and the municipality that the project is in and get their consent to use the PFA. They wanted to drive borrowers to them as a conduit issuer. And the irony is it didn't work. Nobody goes to Milwaukee County to be a conduit issuer because they're very difficult to work with and we're talking crazy fees. But now every other county and municipality has to live with that requirement because Milwaukee County wanted to be. And the presumption was any county would want the first crack at being able to be the conduit issuer. And clearly I'm finding out not the case, but.
Just to follow up then, I understand it's in statute that you have to get, consent for them. What if they don't even have, and I'm not trying to weigh in as to whether or not they have capacity, because it doesn't really fall on their bonding capacity, the authority, but to issue the conduit. So I guess I talked myself out of the question. Never mind.
Yeah, the PFA has done over 500 bond issues since it was formed, and they have a board that meets regularly and meets as needed. And it's fairly routine for them to work on a conduit bond, because they do it so often. Now they don't negotiate things because they're just a conduit. That's not to say that in your discussions, you can't try to negotiate, obviously your fee and talk about the project and learn more about it. But it's streamlined except for this consent issue, which is confusing to people. And you're not the first county to say, I don't understand. Why am I doing this?
So I'm sensing that people want additional information. Let me put forth a path forward for discussion. The issue is, how is financing obtained? And the issue is, do they do it through an initial resolution and subsequent action by the county board? Or do they do it through a certificate of consent is signed by the clerk? And we can bring both of those items forward, but I would like to have the input from the two other committees relative to their concerns, relative to the issues, and that would be an opportunity to raise the issues. But I think we want to be careful to focus on the issue at hand, and that is the financing of it. The issue of the size of the operations at a facility are maybe somewhat immaterial to the funding source. And I think we have to be careful to look at what are the issues before us. And while there's a desire to find out more, that's part of the discussion and may form the basis for somebody's vote. That's not really the issue before the board. So does it make sense for us to look at, and there's really a third option inherent in all of that. Do we do the initial resolution ourselves? Do we do the certificate of consent, or do we not take any action and therefore oppose the project? So those would be the three options. We could bring those back on the 13th. In the meantime, direct Corporation Council to talk to the other counties to find out what the scope of the local agreements are relative to terms. Try to encourage the other committees, ERC and EEDC, to look at the the other policy provisions that they would want to make sure that we consider going forward. Does that make sense, sort of directionally? I'm seeing nods. Chair Gibbs.
It does, but again, I reiterate, I think that we owe it to the requester that we provide them clarity in December for the specific business reasons that they have initiated, and saying that they want to at least get allocation out of the $300 million of tax exempt from WEDC for 2023. And I just remind people that the size of that operation is controlled by DADCAP, Department of Trade and Consumer Protection, and the issuance of their authorization. And the DNR issues the air quality permits. So there is also additional oversight that's much more greater than from our CPZ department. Again, we don't have any authority when it becomes a CAFO. Those all refer to the state and the state authorizations and those permits.
Supervisor Hart.
Thank you. And my comments are kind of reiterating what Chair Gibbs kind of said. My overall thing is I don't want to delay this because of something we did. I think it's important that we move forward in December, regardless of what we do. I want to make sure that we're moving it forward, whether we issue the bonds or not. Thank you.
So unless there's an objection, we'll ask the Corporation Council to look at those other options, bring in the options at the next meeting, and then we will, based upon the feedback we receive from those other committees, either, make a recommendation to the county board, if that makes sense. All right, we have a path forward. Thank you.
Okay, let me just reiterate, tomorrow when I find it, I will send you a sample of the PFA fee schedule so you can see comparably what their fee looks like and whether that's something that will guide you if you develop a policy on being a conduit issuer, whether it's for this borrower or others. And if there's anything else that are questions that arise that would be helpful to this committee or even other committees, Lance, if you just let us know, we'll get it to you just as quick as we can.
Thank you, Linda. Could you also send the Milwaukee policy if you have that readily available?
I don't know if they have a policy. I mean, they said they were going to. I took one project to them when they first got their conduit financing ability, and they told me it would take 6 to 8 months to get an initial resolution from them, and that they were going to charge an outlandish fee, and my borrower got up and walked out. So we were meeting with the county executive. So I can effort to see if there is one, but I don't know if there is.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, any other questions, comments? If not, we will move on to the naming rights relative to the Forensic Science Center project. And I think also included in that is a update on where we are with that project. So Administrator Leonard and Vice Chair McEwen.
Sure, I'll start and quickly hand off the mic. So today, at its core, we're seeking support here today for a naming and recognition concept that that staff and the Morgue Task Force have been discussing for spaces within the Regional Forensic Science Center building, as that was identified as really an important tool in the fundraising process. So that's why we're here, and to help you get you some context as to that concept. Jess is going to give you a brief update on our continued construction document work. Sarah will then give you a snapshot of where we are with respect to our fundraising effort. Mike is then going to walk us through our existing naming right policy that was adopted by the board a number of years ago, And then Sarah is going to wrap up with a general, again, high-level overview of the concept we believe that would be helpful in that fundraising process. So first, I'll kick it over to Jess.
Right, thank you. Do you want the slides up?
Driving
Oh, slides.
all the way at the end.
Well, as Lance is getting the slides ready, I can just do a very brief project update. We remain on schedule with the architectural designs. We are roughly 50% through the construction documents. The goal is still to be done with those documents in January. Since our last meeting, we did hire a construction manager at risk to join our team. That has been a great addition. The firm that we are working with has just completed a similar project and has been able to provide us a lot of invaluable information and different key takeaways from their experience with that project, and able to mitigate a lot of future issues they would have with the construction project and reduce change orders, which eventually saves more money in the long run. So things are going really well with that. And I don't know if any of you have seen, there's a conceptual rendering up on the screen of what the facility will look like. We will be getting another updated image of that facility sometime in January.
All right, thanks, Jess. So the next slide that you'll see in the packet is kind of our funding status to date, actually as of this morning. So the total project is estimated to be at 14.8 million. And on the chart, you'll see that to date, we've secured 10.17 million. So roughly about 70% of our goal. That amount includes the $7 million match from the state, which is contingent on us raising that $7.8 million to complete the other portion of the project, the $2 million in ARPA funds, and then some other grant funding that we have had come in as well. We do have 2.175 in pending funding. Those are applications that we have submitted. A significant portion of that is the $2 million of congressional directed spending that is sitting at the federal level connected to the federal budget. And then funding applications in process, about 5% of our project amount, or 780,000, is current applications that we are in the process of writing and submitting to area foundations as we speak. Many of those deadlines fall between December 1st and December 15th. So those applications will be shored up here relatively quickly. And then as of today, about 11%, or 1.675 million, remains unidentified. And so what we are doing to certainly lower that number is we're continuing to meet with businesses, with foundations, seek out other opportunities on a national level that align with our project that could contribute to the funding. So that work continues to be ongoing as we are completing applications and as we are continuing to meet with other potential donors. So with that, I'll turn it over to Corporation Counsel to kind of talk about the current naming policy, and then I'll circle back at the end to talk about some of our thoughts and ideas around donor recognition.
Thank you, Sarah. In your packet is the existing naming rights policy. It was adopted by the County Board in 2016 by resolution, and attached to that resolution is the policy itself. If you read through that policy, it's really a two-pronged approach. It covers both naming for buildings in the sense of like a memorial to recognize a particular worthy individual or group, and also anticipates naming rights for fundraising or donor purposes. So understanding that it has those two prongs and two potential applications, it does outline a process for how naming rights would flow and be granted. Initially, there's an application process. The application would go to the county clerk's office, including a description of whatever donation is at the heart of the potential naming. The clerk then is tasked with forwarding that to the county administrator, who assigns the review of the naming rights proposal to the particular department head that is related to the request. Likely our medical examiner would be involved in that. The department head would make a determination about whether the application is consistent with this naming rights policy. So the policy itself actually outlines some criteria about things to avoid, such as names that would result in overt commercialization, names of companies whose business is derived from the sale of alcohol, tobacco, firearms, adult entertainment, or other practices considered unsuitable or inappropriate for children. It also has some general criteria about organizations having a longstanding affiliation with the county. And specific to donations, the criteria include whether the group or donation has been instrumental in allowing the county to move forward with the overall financing. If the department head determines that the application is consistent with the policy, that application is forwarded to this committee, Human Resources, Finance, and Property. This committee is empowered under that resolution to approve or deny the naming rights that are particularly proposed. They can also, this committee can also elect to move that decision to the full board if it chooses to do so. The policy indicates that that's in the committee's discretion. It does give those criteria, but ultimately it's the committee's discretion as to whether to allow or deny the particular naming rights. So that's really the process in a nutshell. As I indicated, there are specific tracks for individuals versus groups or people who would be involved in donations. The county does have some authority to create conditions of acceptance of grants or donations. So nothing about this policy would prevent us from, for example, putting a length of years on how long the sponsorship would be or things like that. And then ultimately it's this committee's determination about how to move forward with particular applications.
Okay, so as we kind of look beyond the policy with that insight that Corporation Counsel shared, the concept that we are looking at relative to the Regional Forensic Science Center is the opportunity to have naming rights of select spaces within the facility. So up on the screen is another slide looking at donor recognition. We have earmarked a few spaces that we think would be attractive to potential donors. Those spaces being the family comfort room, the tissue donation area, a teaching observation area, a training room, and then the Lodox, which is a piece of equipment. And the concept that we're bringing before you today is we're really looking for support of a naming rights concept as we solicit some larger donations. You know, as I went over the funding a few moments ago, we have about $4.6 million in unsecured funding for the project. And so as we meet with potential donors that could bring forth sizable contributions, you know, we look at that kind of $500,000 to $1 million plus mark. It's appropriate. It's an industry best practice in fundraising in capital campaigns to offer them some type of naming ability within a facility. And so, you know, as we've looked at the project, this is kind of our thoughts and what we would recommend for consideration. And so, if there's support for this, we would be able to bring this forward to potential donors as we're either writing grants or meeting with them, knowing that we would have support for something like this, knowing that this committee would still have final approval at the end of that exact organization's name that would be sponsoring that space. We do have an area foundation that did give $1 million to the project so far. So they would certainly be up for consideration for naming rights of one of these spaces if they so choose. And then that kind of talks about the larger sizable donations, but we would also look to have donor recognition within the facility as well as in the grief garden, which will be exterior to the facility. But up on the screen are some images from the Aquatic Therapy Center at North Central Healthcare and kind of how they did donor recognition with kind of the collage wall recognizing the organizations that contributed to that project. And then it's kind of hard to see, but in that lower right-hand corner is a couple more blocks that list all of the other individuals and contributors towards the project. Certainly, the more financial support that the individuals or organizations provided for the project, the larger that their name is within this recognition.
Thank you. You guys did a great job. So again, the idea being we're here with a general concept, as Sarah alluded to. At the end of the day, we recognize, and the Morgue Task Force recognize, that this committee ultimately, if we did come back with a specific recognition plan or naming for select spaces, you have this body has the authority to review that and ultimately give it's either approval or reject the plan. But we wanted to bring that concept to you first to at least have you understand that concept, provide feedback. But again, this comes from kind of where Sarah laid it out, that this is kind of a best practice in fundraising in our planning efforts and speaking with local foundation, local leaders. It was suggested to come up with such a framework. So we did that again, not only as staff, but working with the Morgue Task Force. And we're happy to answer any questions or.
So there's a second part of this that will be coming up the next meeting.
Well, it would come up, and I take it the second part, just for clarification, is the actual approving of each of those select spaces for the individual or entity that would provide the donation?
And the overall funding for the project.
Correct. So I guess there's two additional pieces that would come. As it relates specifically to naming, yes, there would be another meeting at which you would have as Corp Counsel alluded to, that application would come forward. We would evaluate it. It would be in connection with, the fundraising. But to your point, Mr. Chair, yes. In fact, Task Force Chair McEwen spoke with me today about assisting him with the preparation of a resolution that would come forward, I believe, next month to really lay out what those next steps are to move that project forward. Again, we've talked about it at a number of committees, including this committee and the full board. The goal, as Jess alluded to in terms of time frame, is really to get those construction documents completed no later than the end of January, so that if the project is approved by the full board to move forward, you can release those bids, those requests for bids in a very timely manner. But you're certainly correct, Mr. Chair, that would be a point of discussion for a future meeting.
Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So from what I understand, the policy says that you can have authority to accept donations of up to $30,000 will be forwarded to this committee for consideration. However, you're looking to have naming rights at $500,000 or more. Is that correct for these spaces?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Can I add one thing with respect to the donations? I think Supervisor Marshall, you bring up a great point. The way that this was structured in working with the Morgue Task Force was the Community Foundation is going to essentially serve as the primary collector of all of the donations so that we didn't have to come pursuant to the rules to say, hey, we have a $10,000 donation. Would you accept this? And then come back next week and have kind of the drip effect. They are serving as the fiscal agent to secure all those donations. We would, of course, come here to this committee and the full board to accept all of the balance of the funds that the Community Foundation would be able to accept. Again, at some level, it's, the donations that are going to be available, the other funding streams that Sarah laid out in the slide. At some point, we need a decision from the full board. It's not a staff decision, it's a policy decision. Is a project essentially a go or a no-go? And we'd expect that. I have to meet with Mr. McEwen here, Chair McEwen of the task force after this meeting to kind of help him put together that resolution.
Mike?
Just to clarify as well, in the existing policy, it does also encompass donations in excess of $30,000. As written, the policy would require approval of the Capital Improvement Committee and then forwarding those onto this committee. The Capital Improvement Committee was, of course, dissolved a few years ago by rule, so that leaves the approval at this committee again. The $30,000 threshold is outlined in that policy. Unfortunately, that Capital Improvement Committee no longer exists, so the next step would be that it would come here.
Chair, or Vice Chair McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I again want to thank the board for their full support of this. 6 years ago, I didn't think we'd be having this discussion about naming rights. But at the task force meeting on the 31st of October, we did talk about this. We wanted to make sure that the process was being done correctly, and so we can move forward with it. So ever what this committee decides, the task force will certainly abide by that. So we're just asking for direction on the naming rights. So thank you.
Chair Gibbs.
Well, with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to support the concept of utilizing a donor wall and offering naming rights for various spaces within the Regional Forensic Science Center to aid in their fundraising.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion on that issue? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of that motion will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. All right, so then we would look to, I believe you're going to go to the Public Safety Committee and then this committee for December. Vice Chair McEwen?
Yes, that was discussed also, that we would go to public safety to make sure that they approve of this also.
Okay. All right. Then we will jump back to the agenda, item 6B1. Review of fund balances and policies. You have a handout, and I apologize, I had developed this last week and shared it with Supervisor Baker for input, but then life intervened for me in a number of ways. So we're putting this forward to begin the discussion on fund balances and priorities, and I'll turn it over to Administrator Leonard for a quick introduction, and we'll go from there.
Quick introduction. The document before you is, I printed out. Those were Supervisor Robinson's wonderful ideas, so I won't claim them as my own. But I just wanted to share from, staff perspective, certainly anything that you're requesting, I think we can put into the annual budget with sufficient notice. I fully appreciate that the feedback that I've received that you'd like to have more information about fund balances in that budget. I'm committed to doing that. If you see any, and I don't want to jump ahead to item number 3, but anything with respect to the budget where you have feedback, again, I'm just working off of what our past practice has been and trying to improve upon it. This certainly, I think, in my contemplation, better defining what those funds are in the ways through the questions that are on the sheet, I think certainly would help. My initial contemplation in speaking with Committee Chair Robinson is that we would include the information in the budget and include for lack of a better term, a glossary with kind of laying out what the definitions for the various funds and what's the difference between an internal service fund, for example, and a reserve fund, but then also have dedicated space within the budget to have each of the pieces of information on this form. And I've started, after speaking with Chair Robinson this morning, I looked into some previous budget documents to see what, if any, fund documents or information was included. And it looks like back in 2005, there was some reserve fund documentation included in the budget. So if nothing else, I'll do some more digging to see if those templates are still viable within our Workday system when we are ending up to run those reports, or if it's more driven from the audit, which I suspect it's more audit information.
So my thought going forward would be for us to take a look at all of our fund balances and what is there, how did we get there, what authority do we have, what is the common policy. It's hard to track down those policies, but then have a document that we can present to the county board so that they would know. For instance, the library fund is basically they have under statutes the ability to capture any unspent dollars to be put into a fund. I think we want that spelled out. Where does the money come from? What uses does it have? Who controls that? I think the social improvement fund, there's a lot of confusion as to, well, you've got 14 million in there. How much is really the county's and how much is not? How much is discretionary? What can we do with it? I think over the next couple of months, it would be helpful if we could look at all of those funds as a committee to determine where does the money that comes into it go? What's the balance? What's the history? What are the strings attached to it? Is there a requirement that we maintain a certain minimum, et cetera? But I think what I'd like to do today is just start out the discussion by making sure that we've got all the questions that people want answered going forward, and then we can sit down with Christy and others to get those answers. And if we don't have a formal policy, try to get a formal policy, or at least reference where that policy is so that county board members aren't looking through 1998, 2004, 2005, whatever the year is for a policy that we think is there but may not be there. So are we capturing the questions that members would want answered going forward? Supervisor Lemmer has her.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe this is just my question, but you always told me I should ask it anyway, so I'm going to. Would it be helpful to anybody else, because it might be for me, of when the funding comes in? For example, when some of the work I do at the ADRC, some of the funds come in at the beginning of the year and they're not spent until later. Sometimes they come in at the middle of the year, and so they're accrued. Or anyway, I think there was some confusion as to when the money is spent, because when bills are paid doesn't always match when it's received.
I think that can be something we make sure we discuss. Are there other thoughts? And Supervisor Baker, I would look to you because we've had some discussions privately. Is this list complete? Do we want additional information?
Thank you. So, as many of you know, I've spent quite a bit of time on this topic. I've done quite a bit of review, and I have written a couple posts on my blog, supervisorbaker.blog, looking at what the policy is, what the practice is. So I think that's a good list. I would agree with that we should answer those questions. I did have a couple of comments. So interestingly, to me, I spoke with our auditor, John Rader, last year after the audit was presented, and I had a few different concerns and topics to discuss, including the concept of adding a county auditor. And during the conversation, Mr. Rader basically, I would say, did not share my concerns. And that's fine. I'm not being critical about that, but I'm just saying, you know, I addressed a number of concerns, and he took time, explained, you know, why they weren't really issues. At the end of the conversation, without me asking, he volunteered. He said, you know what really concerns me, and this has been a year and a half, or a year and 3 months, so my memory is not perfect. But he said, my biggest concern is Marathon County decided to stop doing the CAFR report. And I asked him why that was a cause for concern. He said, well, the CAFR, just comprehensive annual financial report, includes a table that shows the changes in fund balances. And, you know, I'd only been on the board a few months. I wasn't that familiar with the financial statements, and I really didn't understand the significance of that, what he had shared with me. But now looking back, that seems pretty significant to me. So, you know, I wasn't on the board when we decided to stop doing that in, I believe, 2018. I believe 2019 was the first year that we hadn't completed that report. And that report has a 10-year analysis of changes in fund balances, which is pretty informative, I think. So as part of this, I would like to have, or separate from this, but I would like to see a discussion of whether we should start doing that again. And then the second point is, and this will be probably, should be a topic of discussion. I believe that the CIP rollover practice is incompatible with transparency and good budgeting practice. But the CIP rollover practice basically builds in over budgeting into the process. And year-to-year comparisons are only made to the previous year's over budgeting, not to actual expenditures. So just to use the social improvement fund balance, each year for the last 3 years, it was $3 million over budgeted. And when those comparisons are made in the budget, they're made to that over budgeting of $3 million. I think that we should be budgeting for expected expenditures, compare these expectations to the prior year's expenditures, and then provide tax levy and sales tax based on realistic expectations of revenue and expenditures. And for those departments with year-to-year unpredictable variations, we can add a clearly labeled contingency for the department and fund that contingency from fund reserves. So budgeting in this way should provide some capacity to provide funding for the CIP projects, because if we actually use expected expenditures, I should leave some additional funding. And that could be then put into a long-term CIP fund or a current year CIP projects. So instead of looking back a year and a half to look at results, I'd like to see us budgeting actual expected expenditures, our expected expenditures, comparing those with actual. So I'm just basically would like to see us have that discussion as part of the CIP discussion. Thank you.
Are there, Supervisor Hart?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make a comment about the over budgeting in particular, and push back against that a little bit. I don't have direct information on other departments, but one of the departments that gets accused of over budgeting is social services, and I serve on that board, and it's a department that I care a lot about. I push back on the concept that they're over budgeting because I believe last year the administrator asked every department to do a broad cut of 2%, and social services did 3%, so they went above and beyond. This year, I don't believe there was a directive to cut any budgets, but they again brought their budget down again from the previous year. So that is not over budgeting by any way when you have a department that is consistently deciding that they don't need as much year after year. And for them in particular, a lot of that directive is coming from the federal government with family care, or the a law that was passed in 2018 that asks for the social services departments to put kids in less expensive placements, usually with next of kin, instead of putting kids in foster care or any type of placement that is a high cost. It's a good value for the county. It's a good thing for kids to put them with people that they know. So I just have to push back against that concept and the concept that we're over budgeting in order to inflate our fund balances. Like I said, I can't speak to the other departments, but I know for that one in particular, that is definitely not what is happening, because then that would mean they wouldn't be cutting their own budget by more than they're asked every year. Thank you.
Supervisor Lemmer?
Sorry, I did not put my hand down.
Okay. Chair Gibbs?
I also have to push back a little bit on the discussion about intentionally over budgeting. When we talk about the high cost placements, and I think the department ought to be rewarded for the success that they've had in allowing and in some cases moving what would have been high cost placements away from high cost placements and effectively saved dollars. And yes, it went into the social improvement fund, but it didn't get spent. The key item in the implication that you are over budgeting intentionally to fund CIP is a little bit is a stretch when you effectively have those dollars effectively available and they aren't spent. It is reflective on the success of that department in not having effectively, and social services in not having to put children in a high cost placement. Because let's have one child be in Lincoln Hills, and that's a $500,000 cost per year. That's a high cost placement. So now when we sit there and talk about over budgeting intentionally, that's a little disingenuous. Thank you.
I want to be careful that we separate the issue of budgeting from fund balance, because they are separate items. And what I'm hoping that we can do with this discussion and the evaluation is to look at what funds do we have, what is the current status of it, what are the policies that drive it, what are the policies and where it can be spent, et cetera. How the county board uses that in the budget discussion is a separate and distinct issue and needs to be dealt with separately. If you feel as if when the policy is developed that it ought to be X, you can take whatever is in excess of that and apply it to the budget. But let's be careful that we focus in on the fund balance policy in not necessarily the overall budgeting. You'll have that ability to look at where the funds are used, but I think we really haven't looked at it. The concern that I had when you look at the social improvement funds, were we looking at it the same way in 2020 that we were in 2017? How did the reserves grow? Why did they grow? Should we have been doing something differently? I think that's our hope. The budgeting issue will be a separate issue for the county board to deal with on what the appropriate level is going forward. So I hope we could look at the fund balance policy separately. Administrator Leonard?
I guess I have a question for the committee just to help, as the chair referenced, as you have these conversations. Is there information that you would like me to reach out to from colleagues? I know it's been discussed even in this meeting about our CIP process and utilizing that rollover for capital. I know of one other county that does that. Would you like me to gather information from other counties on their strategies for the various funds that we're talking about? Or I'm just trying to help you, as you referenced, Mr. Chair, as you have these conversations. We're all a creature of our own existence, and my existence is here with Marathon County, and that CIP rollover practice has persisted for a long time. But I know it's not the only approach that's used in the state. So if you'd like me to reach out and gather information, I'm happy to do that. I just wanted to make that abundantly clear.
Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do think that when fund balance excesses feed reserves, that makes them inseparable. There is a time, about a year and a half between, but when one feeds the other, they are related. I would say that the biggest thing that I found would be helpful is we didn't have a forecast for how a current year. Every place that I've done financial analysis was they showed historical last year's, the current forecast, and next year's budget, and that allows you to see trends. And so I think not having a forecast was really hindering us this year in that analysis. Also, I noticed that in this past year, there were no vacancy, in other words, negative dollars for open positions. That typically would lend itself to say that, yes, we are never going to be fully staffed, and therefore we're budgeting for excesses. But again, if we could have a forecast showing last year's actuals, this year's forecast, next year's budget, that would be most helpful. Thank you.
Chair Gibbs, then Supervisor Baker.
I think one of the things that would be helpful to me would be an understanding of what other counties do on all of these fund balances and what their policies are and how Marathon County compares to these other counties, at least other counties of comparable size. Are we appropriately funding our fund reserve? In light of all of the policies that we have, whether it be the Social Improvement Fund, whether it be the Highway Reserve Fund, whether it be whatever fund it may be, as it relates to our reserves, and how does that correspond to similar counties? And how does it have, because I think it really has a long-term impact on our bonding ability and our bonding rating. So I think we need to understand how those all interplay.
Supervisor Baker.
Thank you. So from the responses to my comments, it was obviously misunderstood what I was trying to say. So I use the Social Improvement Fund as an example because it's, one we've discussed quite a bit of. My point wasn't that the Social Improvement Fund was over budgeting, although I mean, obviously that has been the case. My point was that the concept of using CIP rollover funding requires over budgeting. Without over budgeting, there is no excess to roll over into CIP. So that's not a criticism of what Social Improvement Fund has been doing. That's just a statement of my observation. Maybe others look at it differently. But my observation of the whole program is set up that the only way it's functional is that we over budget. And now we're budgeting tighter. It's been both, I believe, Chair Gibbs and Administrator Leonard have said, we're budgeting tighter, and that's an issue because that doesn't leave us as much for CIP rollover funding. I don't know how one could argue that the policy works without over budgeting. And by the nature of that over budgeting, it takes away transparency from our budgeting process. And as Supervisor Marshall said, the two are tied together. We don't have a CIP rollover policy without the budget. So, I wasn't being critical of social improvement, the Social Services Department. Supervisor Hart's comments proved my point. The Social Services Department has cut their budget by 2 or 3% each year, but the budget has no relationship to expenditures because it's $3 million different. So you can easily cut your budget by 2-3% a year. So that doesn't dissuade from my argument. That actually proves my argument. Thank you.
Again, what I'd like to do today is focus in on what questions do you want to have answered or addressed in our evaluation of fund balance. Supervisor Hart.
Thank you. And I do really appreciate the point that Supervisor Marshall made and estimates. And I do want to point out that social services does do a forecast every year. So in the passage of their budget in 2020, 2023, this year as well, they have historically put all of their data going back. I think they do 5 years. And then based on that trend, it is based off of their placements and how expensive they believe that those will be. So that is already included in the social services budget. So I don't know how that relates to other departments. Like I said, I can't really speak to other departments where I'm not as familiar with, but that forecasting is included in there. And just to maybe put a cap to all of this, I do like the direction that the chair has with all of these, because I think education is a big part of this. And I've said this before, and I will reiterate, a big part of this is also learning about all of these departments. The Social Services Fund, or the Social Services Department, passed all of their budgets at our board very, very transparently. I mean, they spelled out every single thing that they spend on with those placements, with those forecasts. So I would encourage the supervisors to go to those meetings, to ask those questions, to ask the department's heads through the administrator, of course, but that's a big part of all of this. And I think learning the answers to those questions is very important before we step forward into creating a policy based off of information we don't know yet. Thank you.
All right. Any other thoughts on how we proceed? Chair Gibbs.
I think the other thing that would be helpful is a listing of all of the various funds that we do have that have a fund, a reserve fund specifically, and if we have currently a fund balance policy on that specific fund.
So we will work with administration on developing that list of funds, and then what I'd like to see is perhaps a matrix at the end of the day, so we've got a reference for all supervisors, so they can, social improvement fund is covered in here, can spend money on X, current balance is Y, so there's a place that we can go to grab that information. And then the ultimate limits of funding. I understand Supervisor Baker and Supervisor Marshall's concerns. Those are, the issue of where are we going with the budget and what are we setting the level at. And one of the options is to budget tighter and then put money in contingency, but those are all future discussion items. So if this is acceptable, what we'll begin to do is we'll probably schedule a fund balance, we'll give an overview of all of our fund balances, but then drill down into a couple of them individually at subsequent meetings, and then see if at the end of that process, if you have questions and if we can move a policy forward or recommendation. Supervisor Marshall.
I know that it's related to next year's budget. However, could we have that in January? Is that a reasonable time frame to turn it around?
My hope, I will just interject this, my hope is that we have it in place by the time we deal with the auditors. If we send this year's expenditures to the auditors so that they can look at it in case we have some recommendations relative to changes. But I'll leave it, turn it over to Administrator Leonard.
I was just going to say that I have a meeting with Christy tomorrow to talk about a related issue. So I had the question of what's an appropriate timeline to pull this information together. So I hesitate to say January is fine until I talk to Christy, because they do still have a lot of work to get done and also prepare for year-end of audit. But I will certainly get back to you at your next meeting.
I think that would be our goal. I think we all share that desire to have it done soon. All right. Process for disposing of excess county property. And Mike, you've done some background work at our request, so I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, so in your packet, I tried to put together the legal authority that governs disposal of surplus county property and disposal of property that the county owns in general. I divided it into the source of the authority. I'll go through it relatively quickly, as quickly as a lawyer is able to do, and then provide some other context. So overarching authority certainly is, oh, it looks like I get to drive too. I don't know if I can multitask. So for a county, overarching authority, of course, is in the Wisconsin statutes. Looking at the statutes, 5952 subsection 6 deals with county property and specifically deals with how a county can acquire property, but also how a county can dispose of property. Subsection C is transferring and disposing of property, and it's pretty broad. It indicates that the county board can direct the county clerk to sell county property on terms that the board approves. So you can't get a lot broader than that language, and that's the general statutory framework for selling county property. I will note, depending on the property that you're dealing with, there could be, certain environmental regulations or other entanglements that might apply, but those would apply to any real estate transaction, not just one by the county. So my review focused on, okay, what is the county empowered to do and not do? So that's really the only statutory authority that directly talks about the county's ability to sell property, says that the county can do it under terms that the board approves. We do have some ordinances that relate to specific property, and I just wanted to highlight a few. First of all, I did include our disposal of used or surplus property ordinance in our procurement code, just to make the note and the point that that applies to personal property, not real property. So in our procurement code, there's this section 3.07 discusses how the county can dispose of personal property that's surplus. It does not apply to real property, so there is no existing part of our procurement code that would apply, which makes sense because ultimately anytime the county is going to sell property, the county board has to make that decision each time. The procurement code applies to procurements that have already been authorized by the county board. Then moving down, I also included in here section 3.20. That deals with the sale of tax delinquent land. So this is property that the county's acquired because it was tax delinquent, either by tax deed or by the in rem process. We recently, this term, updated this statute or this ordinance, so it should be somewhat familiar to you, but it does set forth some specific requirements and ways that the property can be disposed of. It really sets forth how the county clerk deals with that property by public sale if the county's decided not to retain the property for a public use. So that's subsection 6, which I think is on the screen. Yep. So that kind of outlines the way the county clerk is involved to list the properties by public sale and utilize the highest bid under that public sale process. And that's, again, tax delinquent property. That doesn't apply to all property. That's how the board has decided to deal with tax delinquent property. I also included, this is all section 3.20, some Attorney General's opinions because I thought they shed some interesting light on the question about, what is a county board's authority to dispose of property. The first opinion, I pulled some quotes from it because it talks about, in that second paragraph, the county board may, as a matter of policy, determine that it does not want to sell property unless it's sold in a certain manner, for example, by auction under certain conditions, restricting use, or above a certain price. So that's kind of an extension of that statutory authority that I talked about that says the board can sell property under terms that the board sets. And this is kind of a reaffirmation that the county board can decide by ordinance or by resolution or by policy that any sale of county property is going to have these hallmarks or these requirements, and the county board can decide to do that. I thought that was important to note. I also included this additional opinion because it talks about the public purpose doctrine. That is something that we think about more when we're acquiring property, in that the county can't acquire property just for the heck of it. Anytime we acquire property, we have to have a public purpose. And there is a relatively broad interpretation of that, but we can't acquire property to be used solely for a private, to enhance a private company, for instance. We can't, that would be illegal. We can't do that. And it also, the principle of the public purpose doctrine also applies to the sale of property, in that when we're considering whether property is surplus property, that is, whether it has no additional public purpose, that's really the test for whether property is surplus. Is there a purpose for this property for public use anytime down the road? If there isn't, we really shouldn't be hanging onto that property because it's surplus property. It doesn't have a public use. We should not be retaining ownership of it. I think that I caught all of that. I also included in the packet, I was looking through, it was very exciting research. I was looking through some of our previous county board minutes because I was curious, did we ever pass a previous ordinance or policy about disposal of used property? We did, kind of. It's a very broad policy, and it also was overwritten, so it's no longer in our ordinances. But in section 2.04, which is the section that talks about your various standing committees, this was back in 1998. This ordinance was passed, developing a policy which basically said the board directs the county clerk to sell or otherwise dispose of items of real property determined to be obsolete, used, incompatible, or otherwise of no longer use to the county, based upon a determination to that effect by the department head and the county administrator. The Finance and Property Committee may affirm or reject that recommendation. Said property shall be sold or otherwise disposed of in the most cost-effective manner determined by the Finance and Property Committee, and said committee shall report all such actions for informational purposes to the County Board of Supervisors. I included this as an example of what a policy could look like. This was a part of our ordinances and our board rules as a particular task of the Finance and Property Committee, and at some point since 1998, when that committee was restructured, this language was either removed or changed. So it's no longer in our ordinances, but it could serve as some guidance on what previously boards have decided was our policy. Now, it's pretty broad. Obviously, the most cost-effective manner is subject to interpretation, but it does give a little bit of context. So that's the authority I included, and as you can tell, there's I guess a broad palette for the county board and this committee to kind of look at defining policy in this area, and the things to keep in mind are that you do have some ability to put conditions on sale, both broadly on all sales or attaching to particular sales, depending on what policy determinations this committee wishes to put into place.
So when I look at the county's properties, I kind of lump them into four categories. That property that we own that we're actively managing, utilizing, this building, et cetera. A second would be remnant parcels. There are parcels that, because of surveyors, errors, or other things, or highway acquisition, that we may have acquired a parcel and no longer need it. Are there remnant, and how do we address those? The third would be those properties that are excess and no longer needed, and I would lump potentially River Drive, Thomas Street, and others into that, the parking lot on the other side of the gas station. How do we dispose of those? And the fourth would be those that are acquired through NREM or tax delinquency, and what do we go with those, and are there policies associated with that? There's been discussion of if we acquire a homestead property, should we require there be single or owner occupancy for a period of time based upon what's happening in Bayfield? I think all of those are things that we should look at, and I think it might be helpful for us to, if we could at some time, sort of develop an inventory of what do we own, what is in each of those categories, and how would we go about addressing those going forward. We've made some changes relative to our tax delinquent property relative to streamlining the process for taking in terms of the NREM process. We've also evaluated the use of the Wisconsin surplus sale process that Deputy Administrator Holman has worked on. So there are some options, but we need to, I think, somehow bring that all together and look at what do we own, why do we own it, is it surplus, excess, how do we dispose of it, what criteria do we apply to the sale of it. In the state statutes and relative to tax delinquency, there's the opportunity for a local unit of government, if we're not taking the title, they can basically come to us and compel us to take that title and transfer it to that local unit of government. The city of Wausau has done that a couple of times over the last few years. But what is our, how do we want to address that going forward? Does that make sense from sort of a starting point? I know Supervisor Marshall is very concerned that we not hold on to property and that if we that we sell it in a timely manner. Does it make sense to sort of categorize those and move forward with developing an inventory and policy for each? Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, that is exactly what I had written down, is that if we could have a list of the properties and put them into those categories, which are being used and by what department, which are tax delinquent, which are considered other excess, that would help us develop that policy, I believe, knowing how many properties we're dealing with, as well as which ones we have. Thank you.
Chair Gibbs.
I think in the tax delinquent category, I think we got to be careful. There's two, in my opinion, there's potentially two different kinds of property that we've got in the tax delinquent property. One is property that we have, at least up until this point, actively not sought to reclaim those properties because of potential contamination or other factors. And then we have the other properties that are just tax delinquent. And I think the one thing that we need to, at least flesh out when we start talking about the policy is how do we, with the new Supreme Court ruling requiring the excess of tax delinquent property proceeds going back to the former owner, how do we factor that into the policy when looking at potentially a municipality requesting that we take a property and then transfer that property to that individual, and how do we weigh the property owner's rights to that potential excess value?
Supervisor Hart.
Thank you. I feel like I have a vested interest in this because that third category that the committee chair had outlined, all three of those properties are either on my district boundary line or well within my district. So one of the concerns that I have moving forward is giving my constituents the ability to have say over what happens in those properties. So one of my concerns with, I think the original proposal brought forward by Supervisor Marshall for the budget was that it was a sale to the highest bidder. One of my concerns with that is that a sale to the highest bidder, if that's the only outline, it could be anyone, and I could be in a position where I have constituents that now have to live next to something that they had no say over putting there, especially because that was property that belongs to the county, belongs to the people, and then that was sold kind of without them really having any say over anything else but was it the highest bidder. So moving forward with creating a policy, I want to make sure that we provide the committee and the full county board the ability to make those final decisions and not pigeonhole us into this is the only thing that we're going to look at, especially because right now it impacts my district, but there are a lot of properties that the county owns within that category, maybe not right now, but in the future. And if we set ourselves to just the highest bidder, it's downtown Wausau now, but it could be another part of the county that it's the sale to the highest bidder and it goes to an entity that neighbors don't want to live next to. So I think it's important that moving forward, we consider request for proposal. I think that was mentioned in that entire process. And that doesn't mean that it's not going to go to the highest person who comes up with a sale proposal. That just means that we can make a consideration based off of other factors. And I think that's how we best serve our constituents when making those decisions. Thank you.
So what we will do is start with that. I think we can do an inventory based upon I went into the tax records and looked at, there were over 1,000 parcels owned by the county. Now, that's misleading because you can look at a forest and we can have a lot of parcels in the county forest or a county park. But we might want to, just try to categorize those that we own, how many fall into this actively used, surplus, excess or remnant, and then tax delinquent, and as a starting point, and then we can begin to look at what policies we have. I think we have to revisit the tax delinquency in light of the Hennepin County decision, but I don't anticipate that will be a significant amount of work for us. I think that the others will be where our efforts will need to be spent. Do you agree with that process moving forward? And to get at Supervisor Hart's comments, we will need to set up what criteria or factors we would use in the disposition, and perhaps even the discussion on the process if we can, because if we're going to use surplus property, when do we use that, and how do we use it? But those would all be things that we would, as a committee, talk about and then ultimately recommend to the county board. That makes sense. I think I sense we're all on the same page.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Because as you referenced, Mr. Chair, the county does own a lot of property, and you own just going back to last term, I believe it was at the county board, the committee started talking about tax delinquent properties and at the time, the deputy treasurer came in and had a spreadsheet with the various parcels listed. They deprioritize, for lack of a better word, kind of the remnant parcels, the sliver between two parcels that it hasn't been taxed and it needs to be essentially addressed. Those were deprioritized to prioritize the homes, and the businesses, the parcels of value in that tax delinquent process. I just want to make sure, I don't want everything to be the priority and then staff do a poor job of bringing forward to you in a timely fashion the thing you really care about. Is there one of those categories that you referenced and that the committee's talked about that let's start there with a listing that we can bring forward? I would assume that the remnant parcels aren't overly important at this point, but I could be wrong. And if you want to bring forward remnant right-of-way parcels to get those off the plate, we can do that. But I want to make sure we're making good use of your time because you do have a lot of other priorities.
I think there's a difference, though, between inventorying and developing a policy. It might be helpful if we could see what the inventory is first, and then you can focus. There may be some surprising remnant parcels that we wouldn't think are remnant, but if we could start with, I don't know how difficult that would be. I would think that if they've declassified or deprioritized it, they've got to have an idea of what those remnant parcels look like.
And I'll reach out to Connie, the treasurer. I do know that she's down one staff person right now, the deputy that I referenced. He's now the administrator for the Village of Marathon City. But we'll work on getting that inventory, and I'll come back again with a time frame at your next meeting for sure.
Kurt or Chair Gibbs?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't disagree with just the inventory, but I do think that our priority should be developing the policy on excess property and tax delinquent property. I think the remnant properties, once we have identified those, we can possibly develop a policy of trying to get those back on the tax rolls by having discussions with neighboring property owners.
I would agree with that approach. Other thoughts? All right, we will proceed. What we'll try to do, in light of everything we've been throwing at you, I'll work with administration to try to develop a realistic schedule on how we're going to deal with these things so we can present it. I know that these are all priorities and therefore they're not. So we'll try to get a schedule so we can meet your expectations and be able to deliver. So I'll sit down with the administrator and try to get something out developed in the next couple of weeks. Then a review of the budget process. As we've done in past years, it's always helpful to know what do you think went well in the budget process and where do you see opportunities for improvement. We started out with a budget 101 last spring, built in assumptions and priorities and engaged the committees more often. Are there any thoughts relative to any changes? We will be working with trying to incorporate the processes into the rules with the Rules Review Committee, but I'm just, as Finance Committee members that worked on it on a regular basis, any thoughts on opportunities or what went well? And we don't have to do that today, but I wanted to make sure that we thought about it right after the budget process. Ann, Supervisor Lemmer?
Yeah, thanks. This is maybe more related to the HRFP, but where are we at with getting monthly financials so we can kind of see how we're doing countywide?
That's on my calendar to speak. This is Administrator Leonard. That's on my calendar to speak with Christy tomorrow when she's back in the office. She's been out for the last week. Chris, I don't know if you've heard anything on the Workday update. I mean, the short explanation is they're still struggling with getting reports out of Workday, but if we don't have monthly financials out by the end of first quarter for our various committees, I'll be very disappointed. But I will follow up with that exact conversation with Christy tomorrow.
Supervisor Marshall.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One thing that I would find helpful in the analysis is I know that through the narrative was presented to us first, if we could have the detail much earlier in the process, as well as it's customary to have the column calculated year to year and forecast to budget. I know we just had raw numbers, so we actually had to do that. Just raw numbers, like if it goes up $20,000, calculate the 20,000. So it's a year-to-year column.
So just want to make sure, like you want a column that would have variance or percentage increase, something?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Chair Gibbs?
Well, I think one of the things that, at least some of the comments that I heard from talking to other supervisors, the process was much more deliberative, and I think that was advantageous. I do think there were still challenges with the budgeting process. mostly due to the implementation of a new, ERP system, Workday, and not being able to have true comparison to comparison year to year. I know that was a struggle, and but I do appreciate what the process did and brought more transparency to it and more opportunity for the board to have feedback in each of the committees and the discussion that took place at each of the committees. I attended almost every one of the committees at various times during the budget process, and there was some great discussions at various committees on how the budget process worked. So I appreciate the improvement. I know that there's still, as the administrator clearly states, is the challenges with Workday. That's not an excuse. That's just a reality. And I think that the hope is that at some point we have truly meaningful reports in budget versus actual and budget versus comparison for year to year. So I think those will be advantageous to this committee and to the full board.
Other thoughts? I may reach out, Chair Gibbs, to the executive committee, to the committee chairs, and try to get their feedback from a committee perspective, and hopefully that they would go back to the committees. If we could just itemize that for a discussion. I think this is a iterative process. We always get better. I hope we get better. Going backwards is not an option, but think about it. We'll put it on an agenda in the future. If there are some enhancements to the process, I think the forecasting and the budgeting is critical going forward. I would throw out, if at all possible, that the county board get the budget a little bit earlier. I know that creates some problems for administration, but to give us more time with it, at least prior to authorizing it for publication. If that's a possibility, but we'll look at where Workday is, because it seems like we've got a compressed period of time to really look at it and have some input. So, for instance, we received it on September 26th, and then we were by mid-October publishing it, and that wasn't much time.
Can I ask one question specifically about the budget? We've had discussions internally about modifying the capital budget side. And I think a lot of the comments have focused more on the operating side. Are there specific insights or experiences on the capital budgeting side that, hey, we wish we would have done this differently? I'll share that in conversations Chris and I have had. We're hoping to put that earlier in the calendar as well. The capital budgeting side, similar to the operating budget side, as you alluded to, Mr. Chair. The earlier you push, you get benefits, but at the same time, things come up later in the year that, quite honestly, you didn't know about. Just like GTA, we put in an estimate, and our estimate was wrong. But really interested to see what your thoughts are on the capital side.
I would ask that we really develop that 5-year capital plan as part of that, not just the 1 year, but to really begin to let us look at forecasting where our needs are going forward, because that gives you the ability to look at the future and saying, is this needed this year? Can we defer it to next year, or should we move something up? But I think that more of a 5-year plan, and understanding that that's always subject to change, that would be helpful to the board. Chair Gibbs and then Supervisor Marshall.
Yeah, I do understand the desire to have the budget earlier in our hands. The challenges that come with that are, obviously there's certain things that we don't know, especially some of our funding partners, such as the state, and highway funding, and those come later. And in some cases, depending on when we're talking about how much earlier, the state's, WCA's at least, projection on sales tax. So as much as it makes it a little bit more allows the committee more time. The challenges are the accuracy of the numbers that we have as far as expectations.
Supervisor Marshall.
I just would have a question as to, did we leave any projects that you considered end of life? Were there any critical things that were not funded that have been identified?
I think the short answer is no. I mean, there are some things that we would want to address in the next couple of years, but nothing that's at end of life that's going to be, mission critical or something along those lines, where if the status quo is persisting is not an issue. But there are things, I mean, not necessarily small, but you got like elevator modernization. We have 20 elevators. Those are costly. So you got to kind of stay on top of those, and everything's proprietary with them. So you can't really, you're stuck with who you work with. But so those are kind of just, you don't have a lot of flexibility there, but they cost a lot. So we have that already on the forecast for next year. Then projects like the Lakeview Professional Plaza, the sanitary lines, they're not imminently going to fail, but it's something that we've recognized we want to try to get done before they start failing. So we have those on our radar, and after we went through our first round of, all right, what really needs to be in it without a doubt, and what and then the rest were kind of could be this year, next year, maybe the year after. That's what we brought forward. So there, yes, yeah, it's a long answer and a short answer to your question.
I do think the 5-year capital plan is going to be necessary to kind of even those capital requirements out instead of maybe having a year up here and then a year down here. So thank you.
Other thoughts? And again, we'll revisit this issue again. Always looking for that improvement. So I think what you're hearing is that we'd like to see that longer term projection on the capital side. And
Yeah, and can I make one suggestion also? I think Supervisor Marshall's point is spot on. Chris and I had this exact conversation yesterday. That it seems that when you look at our historical capital process, we go 15 years or longer, but between these giant swings of spending a lot of money to maintain our assets, which causes some challenges, first of all, just in terms of budgeting, but it doesn't even that debt service or the payment for those things out. I do think there's a real opportunity for the county, and Chris and I can bring back some drafts on this, and we alluded to it when we were talking about the parks projects at this committee that were approved, about setting aside funding for a capital reserve or replacement, particularly for those pieces of capital, those operations that generate revenue. I think the county would be well served when we talk about the projects at campgrounds. And I think Supervisor Baker brought this up. If you set aside $1 or $2 of the camping fee, similar to what we do at solid waste, into a long-term capital reserve, we don't necessarily have we have to come up with $500,000 or $1 million for these things. We've adopted a similar sort of strategy in a different way with things like parking lots and IT replacement, where we have just a standard amount that's in the budget and we get things on a recurring cycle. But I think that would be complemented well with a policy that sets aside some funding from revenues so that we're not kind of in this catch-up mode.
Chair Gibbs.
I think that clearly aligns with the fund balance policy, and how do we develop that for capital needs.
Other items, thoughts? If not, we will continue the discussion, but please think about other ways to improve. Our next meeting, well, do you have anything else that you'd like to see considered at the next few meetings? I know health insurance and how we're approaching that is a concern. Going forward, we'll keep that on the radar. But we've identified some tasks today relative to fund balance and surplus property. We'll have the forensic, we'll have the whole issue of bonding for the outside entities on the agenda. Anything else? If not, our next meeting is the 13th. We will only have one meeting in December because of the holidays. So that will be a longer meeting, so I just caution you to be prepared for a little bit longer meeting. Anything else? If not, a motion to adjourn is in order. Moved by Gibbs, seconded by Supervisor Marshall. All those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. Thank you. I feel drained.